There's 6 main processes involved in scope management. The first is planning scope management. That's when you make a plan for how you're going to manage scope. We'll get to that on the next slide. The second is collecting requirements, when you figure out what should the result of the project do. After that, defining scope. So that's when you write your formal definition of scope. Creating a work breakdown structure is when you divide all the work of the project into smaller components. Validating scope happens when you're done with the project and you make sure that what you deliver to the client or what the end result of the project is actually what it's supposed to be. And controlling scope happens throughout the entire life of the project. And those are just processes that you have in place to make sure that the scope doesn't get out of control. So let's talk about each one of these in a little more detail. Planning scope management. This is when you make a plan to manage scope throughout the life of the project. And it all starts with some basic documents like the charter, the project management plan, looking at business factors, and you have to develop a plan for managing scope and requirements. At this stage, scope is not really defined yet. You might have a vague idea of what the scope is going to be, but you need a plan for how you're going to manage scope so it doesn't get out of control, and that's what we're going to do here. Common elements for a scope management plan include instructions on, or just think of it as a set of instructions for how you're going to prepare the scope statement, how you're going to create the work breakdown structure, what software are you going to use, what processes are you going to use, what templates are you going to use, how are you going to maintain the work breakdown structure and approve the work breakdown structure. How are you going to set project deliverables? How are you going to control a request for change? So you can't just jump into a project and say, here's the project, here's the scope, without knowing how you're going to do all these things. If you don't have a plan for how you're going to make the scope statement, someone else is going to come in and say, well, here's how you make a scope statement. And you say, no, here's how we make the scope statement. And then the project sponsor comes in and says, no, actually, you're both wrong. Here's how you make a scope statement. If you have a plan for how you're going to manage scope, it addresses all of these. So there's a lot less confusion and people get on the same page a lot more easily. How can you do this? A big part of it is looking at your organization and finding out how your company has typically handled scope management. So if we look at companies like these 4 here, Cisco, Halliburton, Accenture, and DreamWorks, they're all IT companies to some degree. You could say Halliburton is more an energy company, but there's a huge component of Halliburton that's an IT focused, or IT is a big focus of their business. And if you're going to manage an IT project at any one of these, you need to know your organization. How does it handle scope? DreamWorks handles scope a lot differently than Halliburton, and Cisco handles things a lot differently than Halliburton. These company cultures are different. They do things in different ways. And so as a project manager, you're going to have to find out, what did we do before I got here, or before on the last project that I managed? How did scope get handled and managed? What existing processes and document templates are in place to help manage scope? Every organization handles scope differently. Every business plans for scope in a unique fashion. And knowing how your business handles this and planning accordingly is going to help set you up for scope success. Every one of these companies does things in their own way, and every one of these caters to different markets, different customers, and all of that influences how they approach scope. And the big picture here really just involves having a plan for how you're going to manage scope. It can be as simple as a Microsoft Word document that you type up and you say, on this project, this is how we're going to create the work breakdown structure. This is the software we're going to use. Or it can be a complex set of templates that already exist. But you need a plan for how you're going to manage scope. You also need a plan for requirements. And requirements are conditions or capabilities that is necessary in the end result. So basically, what should the project do? What should the result of the project do? In the opening case, it talked about upgrading computers. Well, what does that mean? What should the upgrade do? And what should the end result actually look like? So let's take a look at some examples of what requirements are. If we look at the Xbox One, this came out several years ago, and when Microsoft was designing this console, it was the third iteration of the Xbox, the original, and then the Xbox 360, and then the Xbox One, and so they had to decide, what should this thing do? When we're all done building the successor to the Xbox 360, what should it do? Should it be for gaming? Should it be for TV? Should it be for chatting, augmented reality? What should it do? The final product actually did too much. It was designed as an all-in-one solution. It had like a pass-through HDMI port. You were supposed to run your entire entertainment center off of it. It had Kinect capabilities. It did too much. The requirements for this project were so vast that it did all these things, a lot of them poorly, and as a result, it was outsold by the PlayStation 4 consistently throughout its entire life cycle. The solution then was to revisit the requirements, and Microsoft decided to drop Kinect. It was never bundled with the Xbox, but it was always kind of a component of it, and Kinect was their human-controlled motion control system. They dropped that Kinect. They focused on gaming first and foremost. They dropped the price, and they really kind of refined the requirements of this console to focus on gaming first. And then those set of requirements dictated how the console would be built during the revision phase. When managing a project, it's important to have a plan for managing project requirements. An interesting kind of parallel to that is the PlayStation 5, which as I record this in May of 2019 is not out yet. But Sony's talking about it, and this is Mark Cerny. He recently did some sit-down interviews with different publications to talk about where PlayStation's going from here. On Canvas, I'm linking to an article in Wired from April of 2019, and they basically look at the future of PlayStation. And a big part of this involves collecting requirements. What should the end result do when they're all done making the PlayStation 5? And they decided it needs to load games faster, it needs to have better graphics, it needs to support higher quality audio, and a whole list of things. And those requirements dictate the project itself. They actually had there's a nice little pull quote from the article where Mark Cerny says the key question is whether the console adds another layer to the experiences you already have, or if it allows fundamental changes to what a game can be. As a result of those clear stated requirements, Sony is developing a PlayStation with all these specs, with an AMD CPU, a really nice AMD CPU, an 8-core graphics chip, or an 8-core chip, with a 7nm processes. Basically, it's a super advanced CPU, as well as a super advanced Radeon GPU, as well as a custom audio chip, as well as a solid-state drive, which, as I'm recording this, consoles don't really have solid-state drives. So all of these system specs were dictated by the requirements. And getting those requirements down is really tricky. We're going to explore that more in the next video.